Okay, let's jump right in. Today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty complex, the situation in Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traoré.
That's right. And what makes it fascinating, and maybe a bit confusing for people following it, is the source material we're looking at.
Yeah.
It gives these two, well, completely opposing views.
Exactly. One perspective, the source labels it as coming from die-hard Pan-Africanists, sees things going really well, lots of progress, sovereignty.
Right. A nation reclaiming itself. But then the same source presents this really stark counter-assessment from General Michael Langley, who's the commander of U.S. AFRICOM.
And his view is not good. Decline, rising threats.
Pretty much the opposite. So, yeah.
So just to be clear for you listening, our goal here is to explore these two viewpoints based only on what's in the source material. We're not picking sides.
Absolutely not. It's about understanding the narratives themselves, how they're presented here, and where they clash.
Okay, let's start with that first view then, the one described as Pan-Africanist. It paints a really positive picture, doesn't it?
Oh, incredibly positive. I mean, the source says this viewpoint sees Burkina Faso as not just doing okay, but positively thriving under Traoré.
Thriving. Okay, so what are the specifics? What achievements does this side point to, according to the source?
Well, it lists things like booming agriculture, which is huge. Also, ambitious infrastructure projects.
Right, big building works.
Seems like it. And it mentions the education sector, too, saying it's cracking its knuckles after the colonial hangover.
Interesting phrase. So the idea is education is becoming more homegrown, less influenced by, say, France.
That seems to be the implication in the source, yeah, shaking off past influences. And linked to that is this huge emphasis on natural resources.
Ah, the gold, the minerals.
Exactly. The claim presented is that these resources, gold, other underground wealth, are now Burkinabe-owned, Burkinabe-managed, and Burkinabe-proud.
So the narrative is the wealth stays in the country now. It's not being, what was the word?
Vacuumed out. That's the quote used. They put it very strongly. Our economy belongs to us. Our gold belongs to us. Our underground resources belong to us.
That's a powerful statement of economic sovereignty.
It really is. And Captain Traoré himself, in this narrative, becomes this, living symbol of it all.
The poster child of sovereignty, the source calls him.
Yeah, that's the term used. Him with his defiant posture, sometimes seen with the Pan-African flag, it all feeds into this image of standing up to Western imperialism.
Okay, so that's a very clear picture. Nation on the up, taking control, defying external powers. Got it.
But then
we get the whiplash. Let's pivot to General Langley's assessment from U.S. AFRICOM as presented in the source. It's different.
Yeah, vastly different. He doesn't see thriving. The source quotes him calling Burkina Faso a ticking terrorist-strapped time bomb. He says things are getting worse.
Okay, worse is a strong word. How does he quantify that? What's the basis for this grim view, according to the source?
Security, primarily. He states quite directly that terrorism is at an all-time high and rising since Traoré took power in 2022.
All-time high. And the source mentions he's sticking to this view.
Yeah, says he's faced pressure to maybe soften it, but he insists, just look at the numbers of attacks. It really has gotten worse.
Wow. The source even mentions him calling it one of the most terror-affected countries in the world now.
Exactly. And his perspective, as laid out here, is that these jihadist groups, including ones the source says have alleged ties to ISIS, are operating with near impunity.
Meaning they can pretty much do what they want.
That's the implication. Little effective pushback. And the tragic consequence, highlighted in the source via Langley, is the rising civilian death toll.
Is there a specific number mentioned?
Yes. The source cites him mentioning a figure from some sources. Over 2,000 civilians' deaths in 2024 alone.
2,000. Just in the first part of 2024, potentially. That's staggering, if accurate from those sources. Does he name the groups?
The source indicates he points to ISIS, JNM, which is that big al-Qaeda affiliate in the Sahel, mentioned in connection with the previous ousted leader, and also al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb.
So, major players in the region?
Absolutely. And Langley's bottom line, as presented here, is stark. Traoré is losing the war on terror and fast.
Okay, and why does he think that's happening?
Yeah.
Does the source give reasons from Langley?
Yeah, it does. He argues these violent extremist groups, the VEOs, are exploiting the situation. They're looking for revenue, for resources. They're actively recruiting people.
Finding safe havens, too.
Exactly, finding refuge within Burkina Faso.
Yeah.
And here's the direct counterpoint to the other narrative. Langley argues, according to the source, that this situation, this presence of VEOs, is what actually threatens their sovereignty.
So one side says sovereignty is being achieved, the other says it's being undermined by insecurity. It's just fundamentally different.
Completely. And this ties into another area the source explores: Burkina Faso's international relations, the shift in alliances.
Right. The source mentions Traoré meeting with Russia, China, North Korea, calls it a geopolitical speed dating spree.
Hey, yeah, that's the phrase used, sort of rapidly building new connections.
And how does that Pan-Africanist perspective, presented in the source, view these new relationships?
As a brilliant move, a masterstroke even, a bold pivot from Western dependence.
And there's an expectation of tangible benefits, military aid.
Very much so. The source mentions an expectation of getting loads of military gear, enough to make Rambo jealous. A real game changer for their capabilities.
Okay, but General Langley's take on this, according to the source, predictably different.
Oh, yeah. The source says he's not impressed. He basically claims these new partners, Russia, China, etc., they aren't delivering the goods.
Meaning no actual hardware is showing up?
That's the claim reported. No tanks, no drones, no game-changing arsenals. It's just not happening from his perspective.
And does he offer a different reason for why these countries might be engaging with Burkina Faso?
He does. He suggests it's less about genuinely helping Traoré fight terror and more about strategic positioning, turning Africa into a militarized chessboard.
A chessboard, implying external powers are just playing their own games.
That's the idea presented, where these outside powers compete for influence, and Langley's concern, noted in the source, is that democracy might be the first casualty in that kind of game.
That sounds like a major concern for AFRICOM. What are they watching specifically based on the source?
They're watching these new security agreements very closely. The source says they're questioning the motive. Is it really for Burkina Faso's stability? Or is it more about giving that external power, Russia, China, whoever, the ability to establish a global hegemony of bases?
Setting up military footholds across the continent.
That's the worry. AFRICOM's view, strongly stated in this source, is that the continent does not need to be militarized by these outside forces.
And the source connects the dots regionally too, right? This isn't just about Burkina Faso in isolation.
No, definitely not. Langley's perspective, as presented, emphasizes the interconnectedness of the jihadist threat across the whole Sahel.
So groups in Burkina Faso are linked to Mali, Niger.
Exactly, and potentially further east as well. The source quotes the idea that these groups find refuge in the seams or the borders of these countries. They exploit those porous border areas.
Okay, and how does this connect back to U.S. interests, according to Langley in the source? Why should the U.S. care directly?
Because of the global ambitions of these groups, particularly their links to ISIS. The source states Langley asserts a direct interest for the U.S. in containing this threat.
He draws a line from the Sahel to potential threats elsewhere?
Yes. He's quoted making a link. ISIS in East Africa is inextricably linked to ISIS West Africa and ISIS Sahel. He even foresees potential movement between these areas. And crucially, he states these same networks can threaten our homeland.
That's a clear articulation of perceived U.S. national security interest.
Absolutely. And the source reminds us the U.S. used to support Burkina Faso's previous government's military aid, intelligence sharing.
So what's the offer now? Or the stance from AFRICOM, based on Langley's comments in the source?
Well, he states they have shared objectives, fighting terrorism. And the offer, as presented, is to work with the Burkinabe government and also with the neighbors Mali, Niger, the coastal West African states collectively.
What's the goal of that cooperation?
The source mentions burden sharing and a burden shift. The idea seems to be helping African nations build their capacity to handle security independently.
But there's a concern.
Yeah, the source notes Langley expresses worry that with Burkina Faso's shift away from traditional partners like the U.S., American support might win, which probably means wane or decrease, just as the threat is potentially growing unchecked.
Wow. Okay, so stepping back, the source material presents just two completely different worlds existing in the same country.
It really does. You've got the narrative of the homegrown hero, Traoré, building this brighter future, taking control, boosting the economy.
Right, focused on sovereignty and internal development.
And then you have Langley's grim picture, a country sliding into chaos, losing ground to terrorists, with leadership that might be, as the source puts it, more flush than substance, more style than effective action.
It's such a stark contrast, and the source itself sort of acknowledges this split, doesn't it?
Yeah, it concludes by saying the truth as usual is probably stuck in the messy middle, which is often the case, right?
True. It points out there are things from both sides presented in the source that seem hard to dismiss.
Like the reported gains in agriculture and education on one hand, that suggests something positive is happening internally, at least according to that narrative.
But then you can't ignore the other side's reports, either the escalating attacks, those terrible civilian death tolls, like that 2,000 plus figure for 2024 mentioned.
Yeah.
That paints a picture of deep, deep insecurity.
Exactly. You're left trying to reconcile these fundamentally different snapshots of reality provided by the source.
This deep dive really highlights for you, the listener, just how challenging it can be to get a clear picture when your sources offer such conflicting accounts.
It really does. It forces you to think. How do you weigh an external military assessment of security against an internal narrative focused on, say, economic sovereignty or infrastructure? What does it mean when they seem to be describing different planets?
A really important question to keep in mind whenever you're trying to understand complex global situations based on the information available. Well, thank you for joining us as we've unpacked these contrasting perspectives from the source material on Burkina Faso.
Always good to explore these tough issues. Thanks for listening.